Thank you very much, Joel. And it is a big honor for me to make this presentation for the Finnish fire service. I've been in Pelastusopiston once, a very beautiful practice center. And I did a presentation already, but that is maybe 5 or 6 years ago. So this will be an update, this presentation of what we did in the Netherlands, but also a little bit looking back in where we came from. So in the end, of course, we developed basic principles and the quadrant model, which are now the fire service doctrine in the Netherlands. But I will take you along with the developments and how we came to these basic principles. And probably in the end, you will say, well, nothing new. But for us, that is the same conclusion that we had in the Netherlands. It is nothing new, but we had to make a hard reset because there was a lot of the new developments that needed to be addressed. So this is a short introduction. That is me. I'm from the Netherlands Academy of Crisis Management and Fire Service, and we have a research group consisting of maybe 40 persons, and they are doing research into fire safety and into fire service, which fire service is not only incident mitigation, not only firefighting or technical assistances or rescue, but also we do a lot of research into the humans. Well, I think personally, since I was deputy chief in the Netherlands in Amsterdam for 23 years, I think that fire service culture and the people, the firefighters and the fire officers are a very interesting subject to study. So let's go back to 2008, because I think that is where my mission started. We had a fire in a warehouse, a boat warehouse in the Punt, where 3 of my colleagues died. And I think that that fire was a real game changer in the Netherlands. Before that, there was a general opinion that the fire service did not learn. But the first time that the fire service decided to investigate this fire themselves. And there was an interesting result, because we found out that this fire was not an incident, but an example, which means that this fire could have happened anywhere, and that all the firefighters in the Netherlands would have dealt with it in the same way. As you can see on the pictures, you see the white smoke and you also see the little bit brown smoke. I think that was a very important aspect of this fire. As probably in Finland, I know you do the same. You will probably preferably go inside the building and put out the fire, which was also the idea in this fire. Although a sudden fire spread happened and 3 firefighters got trapped within the fire and they did not survive. But the most important thing is that most firefighters in the Netherlands would have done the same. And that is, of course, interesting, because then we have not an incident, but an example, and there is something wrong in the system. And maybe what was wrong in the system is that we approach every fire from the internal. And when we started looking at the not more detail, but we started zooming out and looked at other fires, then we found out that this was not the only case where we had that kind of sudden fire spread, because we had it a lot of times, and not only in the Netherlands, but also abroad. And the only problem in the fire service is that we did not share this kind of events. And when we started looking at it, we found a lot of examples of this kind of fires. And well, you see these examples here in this picture. And that is when we decided that this was a very important aspect to study further. And that is also what we realized, that fires had really changed. So what we could see is that normally we would go inside, and that was always correct. But over the past, fires were changing, and the fire service tactics did not change with these fires. And that is because we did not really study that. Well, probably you know this kind of pictures and this kind of movies, but of course the fact between the natural materials and the synthetic materials, there is a very big difference in fire development. Especially when you look at the right picture, you can see that there is much more smoke, about 10 times more smoke, and also the heat is the heat energy, the energy content of these kind of materials is much bigger. And where we always taught firefighters that the fire development would be like so we have a first development phase, then we have the fully developed phase, and then we have the decay phase. That and somewhere between we would have the flashover phase. But now we see that fires have changed, that somewhere there is an oxygen shortage. The fire becomes ventilation controlled. And from research from the United States, from UL, we learned that if there is an underventilated or ventilation controlled fire and you open the door, within a minute or 1.5, you will have that again, that flashover. And that is what firefighters who do an internal attack, interior attack, will meet when they, for example, they open the door, go inside, try to find a person or try to find the fire and extinguish it. They have only 1.5 minutes before the flashover occurs. So that is a very dangerous situation. And I think that, of course, now maybe you say like, okay, so you don't tell us anything new because we already know that. But 10 years ago, this was rather new. And this was what we decided, that fires had changed and that fire service also had to change its tactics. So that is one example of where we see that firefighters saw fires that were really different than their routine would tell them. So the old routine did not work anymore in the new situations. I have a movie here. It's maybe for two reasons. I think for you it's maybe nice to see how Amsterdam Fire Service works. A little bit of Amsterdam Fire Service to compare, but also a very important fire, because it showed the Amsterdam Fire Service again that interior attack, if you don't really know where the fire is and how the ventilation profile of the fire behaves, that it can be very dangerous. Because in this situation, one firefighter had a very narrow escape. He almost died, and he is telling about that. But of course, it is in Dutch. I try to translate it a little bit for you, but I think that the images are speaking for themselves. And what was in this case was very important is that the fire suddenly spread against the routine, against the intuition of the firefighters. They thought that this would be a routine fire, but a lot of things happened that were against their routine, and they were really surprised by that, and they shared their experiences. So I will show you this movie and try to translate a little bit in between.
De allereerste melding kwam binnen 's ochtends, rond een uurtje of 8:30.
Oké, 117E. Is iedereen naar buiten of niet?
Nee, we staan op balkon, we kunnen er niet meer uit.
We kunnen er niet meer uit.
So the lady says that they cannot get out of the house anymore.
Oké.
We staan op balkon.
Dat er brand was op de
And she said that there were still people inside the building.
Auto Langer Hendrik. Auto Spuit Hendrik. Landwoning. Maar niks.
Kunt er niet uit?
Nee, we kunnen er niet uit. We staan met z'n allen op balkon.
Oké, hoeveel mensen staan jullie op het balkon?
1,
1?
2, 3, 4, 5.
So she says that there is at least 5 persons standing on the balconies.
Komt een huis, komt het eruit. Wat bij ons bij de trappen
So
begint.
this is a typical Amsterdam situation.
Ja.
Leek me nog mee te vallen, er was lichte rook. Ik heb de bewoner, een van de bewoners heb ik uitgehoord.
And the crew commander says, so we thought that this was a very simple fire. We would put it out immediately.
vertelde mij dat hij brand had beneden in zijn slaapkamer.
So the fire was in the basement.
Dat vrouw binnen moest zijn. Ik heb mijn info gedeeld via de porto. Ja, ik heb gewoon eigenlijk tot op het laatste moment niet doorgehad dat mijn portofoon niet werkte. De ploeg was al bezig met...
Bij die deuropening.
So this is the firefighter who got trapped on the first floor. And he says that he thinks it was the end. So this is a typical situation where, and
Voor de Leijmansgracht.
De monitoren hoe het met u en de rest van de bewoners op het balkon gaat.
so it looks like a very simple fire.
Heel erg in paniek. Maar op
Only smoke came out next door everywhere.
Het hele trappenhuis stond in de fik en die was nogal in
And
paniek.
there was a lot of people on the balconies in the building where the fire was not.
Dat het niet zo was.
So they are asking for more assistance of truck ladders to rescue people. And they didn't understand why these people wanted to jump. Because there was no fire over there. The fire was next door.
We hebben de tweede persoon ook uit zijn woning gered en daarna hadden we nog een dakkapelletje boven. Ja, we hebben 3 mensen aan de voorzijde er vanaf gehaald. We hebben ook, en ja, dan op een gegeven moment zie je toch de collega's rokend en dampend naar buiten komen.
And there a firefighter jumped through the window.
Ondertussen zijn er meerdere kazernes, nog een derde ladder en hoop rook. Dat is het enige wat we wel gezien hebben, hoop rook. Ja.
Vraag je van hier, is er sprake van slachtoffers?
Ja, er zijn een groot aantal mensen uit de woning, maar ik heb geen beeld. Ben je met anders bezig over?
Het begon 's morgens om 8:30. We waren net voor de lunch waren we weer terug. En nou ja, je moet natuurlijk naar bed toe om te slapen, maar het heeft...
So the essence why I show you this movie, apart from of course the nice pictures of Amsterdam and the Amsterdam Fire Service, is that there were 2 important things to learn here. So the fire development was against the routine of the fire service. So they have a lot of fires in the city center of Amsterdam, but this one was different because the fire spread very suddenly. And we studied this fire, what happened exactly and why it could spread so quickly. The second thing is that because internally these buildings were completely renovated and there was only one staircase to originally 2 buildings. So the smoke came out everywhere and the crew commander and the officers in charge, they were in front of the building and they couldn't grab what was happening. They didn't understand this fire. And so they were out of control. They couldn't get into control. And this is an important thing that I will come into later because that has to do with command and control and situational awareness. What can happen with you, especially when you see that you cannot get in control. Maybe you recognize that sometimes that can have a very big impact on your mind and on your situational awareness. So that is why I show you this movie. Let's say the next one. No. Okay, so these two examples that happened in the Netherlands, we studied them very thoroughly, and we got to the conclusion that our routine, which would be an offensive interior attack, might not be the only way that we can deal with a fire. So we developed the quadrant model. And maybe that is even not so new because you probably recognize all of them, but it is an idea of having more options than only one. So we would have only one option, go inside and put out the fire. And now, of course, when the fire is complete, the building is completely on fire, we would choose for a defensive exterior attack and try to prevent the fire spread to adjacent buildings. But even there, we maybe not so scientifically did some things that seemed to work. But the new ones, the offensive exterior attack, was the idea that why don't we try to put out fires from outside? This was completely new because we were taught that the most effective way of dealing with fires was to put them out from interior, and that putting water from outside inside the building would not work. Another option, the defensive interior attack, would, for example, deal with buildings where there is a fire-resistant wall somewhere, and how can we from the interior try to stop the fire at that wall? We thought that we knew we had to have innovative ways to do that, and one of the ideas that we already, and you probably know that the Cobra cold cutter, that would be an idea that we thought we could use. For example, to leave the building closed and put it out from outside, and that would be an offensive exterior attack. So, but of course, we didn't have any experience with that. So this quadrant model was for me, when I started as a professor in the Fire Service Academy after 24 years of being a fire officer in Amsterdam, this was for me a most important goal. Do research and try to find out how we can, for example, use innovative ways of firefighting in these quadrants. And in this picture, I show you all the experiments that we did. Of course, we started with offensive exterior because that was the most challenging thing. That how can you put out a fire from outside without going in? But in meanwhile, we also found out that, of course, the fire development also changed. And of course, there were new techniques like smoke cooling techniques. How does it work? How do we have to do that? Defensive outside of exterior attack, how to prevent fire spread. Normally we would put a monitor between the buildings and it might work or it might not work, but we did some research how to do that more effectively. The defensive interior attack turned out to be the biggest challenge because you had to go inside the building, and most of the time these are warehouses or industrial buildings. It occurred that we had occasions of fire gas explosions due to insulation materials that were placed in the roof. So going inside a building, even in the compartment where there was no fire, could be very dangerous. And that is why this is now, we have developed an hypothesis. How could we do that with all kind of innovative ways? And now we ask the fire service to try it. And we collect all the situations, all the cases where they did try it, and we try to learn from that. That is what we are doing. So in the meanwhile, we also did some research into the command and control, but I come into that later. And at the moment, we finished all these experiments, and now we are trying to learn from practice. So learning from practice is now our biggest goal, and we collect a lot of cases, and we try to make practice cases from them, and we publish them. We share that. So this is, let's say, this movie shows you our first experiments. It is about, because, you know, maybe 10 years ago, we thought that a fire we would be able to model a fire. For example, fire service asks, what is the ideal arrival time of the fire service? And I must admit that I also thought that we could make some kind of model, how a fire develops, and that we could, for example, calculate the ideal arrival time of the fire service. And that is why our first experiments were 6 houses, where we lit a fire in different ways, with doors open, doors closed, and we started to study how a fire develops. And I can already tell you that the conclusion was that there is no standard fire development. And that is very important, because if somebody from politicians ask me what is the ideal arrival time, I always tell them, well, of course, as fast as possible, but that this is not let's say a fire science question. This is a societal question. But you can see here one of these experiments, and I think it's very interesting because we learned a lot from that. And you can see that we in the top picture. So these are all the rooms. In the top picture, you can see that we lit the fire in the living room near the television. When you go to the right, you can see the hallway and the staircase upstairs. In the middle left, you can see the hallway on the first floor. In the middle, there is the parent bedroom, and the door of the parent bedroom is open. And in the middle right, you can see the children's bedroom where the door is closed. And well, I can show you how the fire develops, but especially pay attention to the smoke development. So you can see now on the top that one of my colleagues lights the fire. And you can see after 2 minutes, the smoke already comes up in the hallway. After 3 minutes, you can see it in the parent bedroom. After 4 minutes, you can see it in the parent bedroom. And after 5 minutes, the situation is untenable in the parent bedroom, but you can still see that the children's bedroom is still survivable. Even after 30 minutes, a child could survive there. So there is a very important conclusion was that closing the doors are of big importance. And this was in accordance with also other research from the United States, where they say closing the door is life-saving. But you can see we knew that there was a lot of smoke from modern fires. We knew that it would be fast, but we did not know that within 4 or 5 minutes, the situation in the parent bedroom on the first floor would already be untenable. So this was again stressing the need to know more about these kind of fires. And one of the nice pictures that we had also that I could use to illustrate for firefighters what happens when you change the ventilation profile is the next movie. So you can see that these are the most important conclusions, apart from the smoke alarms, which is maybe also interesting to know, that we found out that smoke alarms only in the staircase do not work. It's too late. So by the time the smoke alarm in the staircase goes off, goes into alarm, it is already impossible to escape from the parent bedroom. So these results have very big impact on fire safety measures and also communication to the society about fire safety. So this one is important. Is nice because because you could see this is one of our experiments. This is the experiment where we lit the fire in the bedroom on the first floor and we left all doors closed. And you can see that, so this was a situation after 45 minutes. Normally after 45 minutes, we would stop the experiment. And we, even with the windows partly open, this fire seems to be ventilation controlled because it did not develop any further. And because the experiment already stopped, we thought, okay, let's do some trick. We opened the front door. And this is a very illustrative movie that we used to educate fire service in the Netherlands about changing fire development. Yes. So you can see one of my colleagues opens the front door. And within, you can count 10-11 seconds, the fire lights up. And this is what we think is that the situation that you could see in the fire development curve, where you have the ventilation controlled fire, you open the door, and within let's say a minute, in this situation it was 11 seconds. So I can ask my colleagues, firefighters, so what would you do when you would arrive in such a fire? So what can you expect? But also, suppose that the front door was open and you arrive, what can you do what is the first action you can do to mitigate this fire? So this is a very nice example for education. And it illustrates something that most firefighters did not realize before these experiments. So these experiments, this is a movie from some experiments we did for the exterior offensive or exterior attack. And of course the question is, suppose that you have a building with more than one room and you have a fire somewhere in that building, but not behind the front door. And suppose that you would, for example, use a fork nail or a cold cutter or maybe even a low pressure hose line or a high pressure hose line, whatever. And you would put it through the front door. Would it be possible to extinguish the fire? Here you can see the effect of the cold cutter. So the idea was, suppose that the fire is not behind the front door and you cannot reach the fire room. So is it possible to put it out from the front door? And the answer was no. So that is, of course, was a little bit a drawback in our idea of putting out fires from the exterior. But of course, the biggest lesson from this was that you have to do a very good reconnaissance, because you have to find the room of the fire from outside, and then you can put it out. So this was so. Of course, it was a little bit disappointing for us, because we really thought that you could put out the fire from the front door, because the idea was that, of course, oxygen and air would be sucked towards the fire and the water would flow with the fire. But even with the cold cutter and the Cobra, of course, says that the water would be carried with the airflow towards the fire and put it out, but it is not true. So this is another experiment, because you saw the last movie was about a building with more than one space, but we also have, of course, buildings like warehouses. And then the idea is, of course, suppose that somewhere in that warehouse is a fire and you arrive in front of the building, would it be possible to put out the fire from the front door? Now, this is already a very sophisticated setup, because you can see that we have a lot of sensors inside, like heat sensors, temperature sensors, radiation, carbon monoxide, oxygen. So this was a real very difficult experiment, and also very difficult to find a building where we could do at least 6 experiments without destroying the building. So we had to protect the building with fire-resistant plates to be able to use it. And here you see again the example of the cold cutter that we used from the front door. And this is interesting, because you can see this is the fire source, which was directed to the rear of the building, and in front it was like a container. So it was impossible to reach the fire source with the cold cutter directly. So the idea is that here you would cool the smoke, and by cooling the smoke, you would create a safe environment to go in and put out the fire. Well, we were again surprised. You can see in the I can stop it for a while, because then you can see it maybe even better, because you can see, of course, the colleagues. And what is interesting from these experiments, that these experiments were carried out by real firefighters. And we invited all the firefighters in the Netherlands, 22,000, to come and see what is happening. So that was really, and I was there to talk to them and have discussions. So of course not all 22,000 were there, but they were invited, and there were 50 or 60 firefighters from all over the country that came to this place and watched. They could watch on monitors. In another building, they could watch on monitors what was happening, and also the temperatures and all the gas concentrations. And well, here in the upper right, you can see the yellow color, and you can see this. You look at the front door from inside, and there you can see also the water from the cold cutter going inside, and in the left lower corner, you can see the fire source, and you can see what happens when you put in that cold cutter. And of course, on the right, you can see what happens later on. So we were surprised, and we still don't really understand what happened, because, it extinguished the fire. It did not only cool the smoke, but it extinguished the fire. It was, of course, the fire was out. And after we opened the doors, within 10 seconds, it relighted again. So this is interesting, because you have to be very careful, because it seems that the fire is out, but of course the water content, the cooling capacity of 60 liters a minute is not that big. So you have to be very careful, but somehow it worked, and we think that it worked because it suffocated the fire with and because of the high impulse of the water stream, it touched the rear of the building, and there it caused for a lot of steam to suffocate the fire. So this is interesting, but still, of course, the idea is that we have to be very careful, and also here the conclusion was that you need to know the seat of the fire to be effective in this. So, well, that is about our experiments that we did for the exterior attack. Of course, I can go into other experiments, but this is, I think, the most important, because it learned us a lot about our tactics that we needed, and maybe there was not needed a new tactic, but we had to revisit our old tactics or make them stronger again. Well, then I already said in the movie in Amsterdam that the fire officer and the crew commanders, they didn't really get a grip on the fire because they did not understand what was happening, because this was a very complicated building that was renovated in a way that we did not expect. And but there was also another fire, a very big fire in a warehouse with chemicals in the Netherlands. And our inspection did an investigation, and they concluded that the command and control system was not followed by the officers in charge. And that I thought that was very intriguing, because, of course, myself, I also have a lot of experience in of course, command and control, and I probably never followed my education, because we had a very, let's say, the way that we do command and control is a hierarchical system. Probably you have the same. So there is a crew commander, and if there is two crew commanders, an officer in charge will be there. And the officer in charge will take over command, and if it gets bigger, there will be two officers in charge, and then there will be a senior officer who takes over command, etc. Which suggests it is an old way that, for example, the military, the defense would work, and we copied it from them. But in meanwhile, maybe 20 years ago, military already changed their tactics, because they have commanders intent, so they just tell the goal, and of course the soldiers, the pelotons, and the officers, they follow the goal and they do whatever they think is necessary. So we did a very big study into command and control, and we found out that two important things. One is that we always overlook our human factors, so we overestimate our possibilities as a human being to deal with this kind of difficult situations under stress conditions. And stress conditions do a lot with you. And for me, I'm a technologist. I studied in a technical university, so psychology and that kind of things is not my let's say my big focus. I don't know much about it, but I learned from this study a lot about dealing with stress. And I learned that the drawbacks of dealing with stress for every person could be the same, because it is neurobiological. So the fact that we are human means that we have difficulties dealing with this kind of stress situations, and that we have all kind of deviations. I will tell you more about it. But so we did that study, and we found out that hierarchical system is not always a good idea to do, because it suggests that the highest officers always know everything and they make the best decisions. But from our studies, it turned out that the officer in charge, if the crew commanders would do nothing and just wait for orders, nothing would happen, because the officers in charge would have information overload and they will freeze. So that is very important, and that is why we changed our command and control system to take into account the human factors, and we changed the education for officers. So this to give you an impression, this is what we teach them now. So we are not so perfect as we think, and it is not let's say a bad idea to ask for assistance if you need it. And we teach officers how to recognize when they need assistance. And one of the things that brains are fooling us, and probably you will understand, I think the most important thing is confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is some kind of deviation that you have under stress, that you just look for confirmation of the things that you already know. But everything that you that doesn't fit in your plan, you don't want to see it. So this is very important. And from practice now, when we study case studies, we see this thing a lot. But of course, tunnel vision and time compression. Time compression is that you think that you are only there for 15 minutes, but maybe it is already an hour. And now we know that if you don't have control of the fire within an hour, that's a very bad thing. You should have control within 15 minutes, and if not, then you need to scale up. That is one of the rules that we now introduced because of this. But the information overload is really very fast, and we see now in practice. But of course, we didn't want to admit that it was true, because we were, as officers, we were afraid, of course, that somebody would say, okay, if you can't do that, then probably you are not a good officer. But now we know that even the best officers would have this kind of deviations, and since we recognize it and we admit this, we can really learn, because it means that we have to take care of a safety net, and that safety net we now are implementing in the Netherlands, and most of the time it is let's say an observer. So you could also say a safety officer. Maybe in the past we always said that we needed a safety officer, but of course leadership always says, yeah, but that costs money. But now we can really we have very good arguments why this is a necessity, because we know we are sure that fire officers and crew commanders will probably not see everything that they need, and especially in the modern cases where we have really very strange situations like let's say cocaine labs inside of domestic buildings. We have all kind of people that are disturbed, living on their own independently. So there is a lot of ways that a fire can probably not meet your routine. So this safety net is in different ways. For example, we have a stop sign. Stop sign is that we need to reconsider what is happening after some time. Dus after, for example, 15 minutes, you need to reconsider, is this still the fire that we thought that we had? Now, that kind of things. Then the last subject that we did a lot of research on was the smoke cooling. Probably you already also learned about smoke cooling. So the idea is, if you cool the smoke, then you cannot get explosion anymore because the temperature is lower. But we had questions very fast, because of course we know now that, yes, of course you see smoke, but the real danger is in the gases that you can't see. So even we have some instructors that say that every fire is a gas fire. And if that is true, then it doesn't matter what is the temperature, because every gas-air mixture, even if it is in a low temperature, with the right ignition source, can explode or ignite. So that is why we started doing a lot of studies into smoke cooling. And I think there is a second reason why we did it. It is because from practice, a lot of firefighters told us that, of course, in theory, it is very nice to do that. Yes, with the pulse technique, the short pulse and the long pulse, and all kind of pulse techniques with all kind of special nozzles to put pulses into the smoke. But it requires a lot of practice. So in theory, it works, but in practice, it is very difficult to keep up your skills doing that. And as a matter of fact, in the Netherlands, when I asked my colleagues, do you do the pulse techniques? They didn't. They only do that in exercises in the containers. So the question is it really true that this is the only way to make a safe entry? And there was the discussion internationally, because from Sweden, of course, everybody says, well, this is the only way. But in the United States, they just put them, they open the nozzle and they make a circle and they push the smoke in front of them and they cool the surfaces. So this is interesting. And then you can see that there is a lot of discussion internationally about this, about the effect, about the practical skills you need, and if there is an easier way. And the most important, I think, thing is that by thinking that you make a safe entry by just cooling the smoke, you forget that you still need enough water to put out a fire. And that is something that, especially in the Netherlands, I don't know, maybe in Finland also, but we used to use high pressure hose lines with about 125 liters a minute. And we would go in with that hose. And if we would not manage to put out the fire, then we would say that the fire is too big. But when you calculate the amount of cooling capacity you need for a certain heat release rate, you can predict that a lot of fires cannot be put out with a high pressure hose line with only 125 liters a minute. So that is that is the change that we made in the Netherlands, is that we also taught people of firefighters that they sometimes have to assess how big is this fire, how much water do I need, and then choose their nozzle. And then from this research, it turned out that it doesn't matter how you do it. If you put in the water to the ceiling and to the walls, or if you just use pulse techniques and cool the smoke. In both situations, if you have enough water, you will put out the fire. So that is a very important thing that is also implemented in these basic principles. And then, of course, and maybe you say, oh, but this is easy. We already knew that. And that is how I explain it now when I go to fire stations, because I've been asked a lot in fire stations to explain what we found, is that in the end, we found that we forgot about the fire triangle. So we teach everybody the fire triangle, but the oxygen part was forgotten. So the heat is, of course, taken away by water. The fuel, if you wait long enough, then the fuel has gone. But the oxygen, opening doors, opening windows, opening roofs, it all supplies oxygen. So it is very easy. Firefighting is very easy in the end. After all this experience, we found out that the more air, the bigger the fire, the more water you need. And if you try to keep the doors closed and have less oxygen, then the fire will be small and you need less water. So this is in fact what we found. And probably you think now, okay, so did we need all this time to do that? But that is what, of course, we made it difficult. And we forgot the easy things. So, of course, you can practice smoke cooling techniques with pulses and special nozzles, etc. But if you open all the windows, then you know that you are not going to extinguish the fire. So, the basic principles, and that is how we do it in the Netherlands now. And we implemented this, and I think that this made a big change. And not that we are new, but we went back to the basics. And the fire triangle is now used more. Using the fire triangle makes that we now pay more attention to the air supply of the fire. So we keep the building closed, and if we go in, then we close the doors behind us. Door control. Stop and think is one of the results from the research on command and control. So we used to go on our experience. So if a fire looks the same as another one, then we use our experiments and we just go in with our high pressure hose line. But now we teach people, the firefighters, that it is not bad to stop and look again. Take a few steps backwards, look again, because it improves your situational awareness. And even I would like if firefighters start doing a little bit of mindfulness. For example, take a deep breath a few times and look again. And we have now the experience that firefighters who do this, they really tell us that they all of a sudden see things that they didn't see before because they somehow control their stress level. The 360 is a very important one. So because we went on our experience, we didn't always do the 360. And of course, the argument of the firefighters and the crew commanders was that probably in a lot of situations, you cannot do a real 360. But it was what we taught them, but they didn't do it anymore. And because of stress and all kind of reasons, they didn't do it anymore. But you need it, because if you want to put out a fire from outside in the safest way, you need to know where the fire is. And so we turned it around. So you do it unless you cannot do it, but you don't assume that you cannot do it, you see? So, and in meanwhile, we keep the building closed instead of opening all the doors. That is what we do. Now, and then we have 3 questions. So do we know where the fire is? And if we can reach it and we have enough cooling capacity, then we can put it out from outside. So the offensive exterior attack is now the prevalent way of fighting a fire. If there is one no, so we don't know where it is, we cannot reach it, or we do not have enough cooling capacity, then we prepare a defensive attack. And only in small compartments where we have a short way to the fire, then we can go inside, but then we apply door control, and of course you need enough water, and we cool the smoke. So this is basically the basic principles, and of course then is the question: how much water do you need? So we use fire safety engineering principles to calculate them. And to make some rules of thumb. And the rules of thumb is that a sofa is about 2.5 megawatts, and one high pressure hose line is also 2.5 megawatts. So if there is not more than one sofa, you can use high pressure, and otherwise you need to switch to low pressure hose lines with between 250 and 450 liters a minute. And that is also what you need, for example, one room, 10 megawatts. So, of course, firefighters, they say, oh, this is difficult because how do we know how much megawatts it is? But we say about a sofa is high pressure, and everything more, you need to start with your low pressure hose lines. And this is a rule of thumb. And of course, we have a lot of discussion, because then they say, yes, but sometimes we had a fire that was bigger than the one sofa and we still put it out. And that is, of course, because of our assumptions that we made in this calculation. Well, and then we had an international validation. So a few years ago, we had the International Fire Instructors Workshop with people from all over the world that came to the Netherlands, and we discussed non-negotiables, what is really important. And they came up with eight of them, and most of them are also inside or are incorporated in that basic principles. So put water on the fire as soon as possible, instead of only cooling the smoke. But you have to cool the smoke if you go inside. The 360 was also one of the non-negotiables. You have to do it unless it is really impossible. So this kind of non-negotiables from the international community of fire instructors was very important, and I think that and it helped us to also validate these basic principles. Now, to summarize, so basic principles. First, take more time, stop and think, take into account your drawbacks as a human being under stress. Then, of course, keep the building closed. is the location known? Can you reach the fire from outside? Is there sufficient capacity? Yes, then you put it out from outside. If not, then prepare a defensive. Unless you have a very small building or a small space and you have sufficient cooling capacity, then you can go in. And if that is all not possible, you can try to do it space by space. So you can, room by room, you can ventilate and make it safe. And otherwise, you can try to do your best and hope for the best, or open up the building instead and then let it burn out controlled. So this is about how firefighters in the Netherlands have it now. And of course, a lot of domestic buildings, they can just go in, but then they need to do the door control and they need to take enough water to go in, and of course, cool the smoke. Now, how did it go? So we had the quadrant model, then we did the research into the command and control. We had a renewed view on firefighting with the basic principles, and that together is now our new doctrine with very old principles. Let's say it like that. So that is, I think in an overview of the developments in the Netherlands leading to, I always say it is not new, but we already had it, but we didn't do it anymore like that. So I think it is a hard reset into how to fight fires. And of course, keeping the building closed was rather new. And we have now a lot of discussions, of course, with firefighters that said, yes, but we are doing nothing because we are standing outside. We keep the building closed, but it works. It really works. And after it works, they are very proud, make movies and tell other firefighters how well it works to keep the building closed until you know where the fire is. So that is in an overview what is happening. The most important research we have translated into English. If you take these QR codes, you will go directly to the English page. Thank you for your attention, and I'm open for questions and discussion now.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ricardo. Do we have any questions from the audience? Please raise your hand, and I give you a floor to ask your questions, or any comments, discussion at this point. Very interesting topic. I put also the link into the chat already, so you can also press there to get to the publications page. No questions yet, but I have here some questions. Since you have implemented this some time ago, we are now implementing it in Finland. Do you have any feedback from the field? How the people who are fighting the fires there in real life, how do they feel about these new techniques and tactics? And have you been able to avoid more fatalities and accidents with these new techniques?
Yes, I will start with the last question because I'm very proud of that. That since 2008, we only had one firefighter fatality when a wall collapsed. And since 2009, we did not have any fatality during firefighting anymore. So this really worked. And of course, we have also discussions because we have firefighters that say, yes, but we still want to go inside because, of course, somehow the adrenaline is also, let's say, it is not so nice to fight fires from outside. But if you have the right knowledge and the right equipment, then it starts becoming nice. And of course, in the fire service, I don't know, I think that fire service all over the world is a little bit the same. So people have to be convinced by doing it and by talking to each other and working with it. So probably in Finland it is the same. But of course, it doesn't go very fast. But after the fire in the Punt, somehow, because everybody recognized this, and this was a story that we could tell and that people started telling to each other. So that quadrant model was, I think, without even changing the education, the basic education, went very fast. The idea that you should be careful by going in, especially in industrial buildings, that went really very fast without, anything. So, and that is what my opinion is, that I always say to our leadership, to the fire chiefs. I say, you know, if you have a good idea, it will go very fast in the fire service. But if you have a bad idea, it will, let's say, it will stop immediately. So you have a lot of bad ideas because you think that fire service doesn't want to change. But my opinion is that firefighters want to change if it is for them interesting. So the basic principles, somehow it went, I think, in 2 stages. So the first stage was that when we were doing these experiments and involving all these firefighters and instructors from all over the country into these experiments, and I started a community of practice with also everybody who wanted to be involved could be involved, and we were discussing and together, because it was not something that I developed, because I must admit that as a fire officer in Amsterdam, I didn't know all of this. I'm surprised that everybody did what I told them, because I didn't know anything about firefighting. It turned out, you know, I knew what my senior officers taught me, and now I know a lot more. And together we developed these basic principles. So somehow it touched firefighters, but of course, 80% of the firefighters in the Netherlands is a volunteer firefighter. Not everybody is that involved in theory of firefighting. So our exercises are still, and that is our exercises are still teaching people the wrong things, because all over the maybe 20 years. They do exercises on their practice evening. Yes, they have 1 evening a week, and they practice firefighting, and they always have a scenario. But it turned out that these scenarios are not adequate anymore. They don't resemble real fires. So what people are getting into their routines is not adequate, and is maybe even dangerous. So and that is a slow process, because now we are trying to give them new exercises who are relevant for real practice, but that is a slow process. But in meanwhile, a lot of ambassadors all over the country were enthusiastic in doing this, and since 2 years ago we changed the basic education, and we re-educated all the instructors in the Netherlands. So now I think that we can say that basic principles is now implemented. But still, of course, keeping the building closed is not so easy for firefighters. And that's why I'm always happy when there is some fire service somewhere in the Netherlands that did it, and and it worked. And now what I try to tell them that is very professional, because they think that it is not professional to do nothing. And I say it is professional to keep the building closed and first put all your hose lines ready and then attack the fire. That is professional. So that is a cultural change. But it is, well, I think it went reasonably fast because of the combination of changing the education, but also having a lot of firefighters involved. So I hope that maybe it is a little bit long answer for your question, but I understand why you ask.
Very enlightening. Anyone, any questions? I still have here a couple of left so that the other people can think if they have anything they want to ask. Do you have any issues with the e-bikes and e-scooters and so on when the people charge them inside and there comes a fire? Have any accidents or any experiments? Have you done any research on this?
Yes. Well, I must say that we have 4 professors. We have 1 professor of fire service science, that is me, and we have a professor of fire safety, and we have a professor of energy transition. And together, the 3 of us, we are dealing with this situation. And what we see is the regulations are far behind. So people are indeed now charging their batteries inside buildings, and also these electrical scooters inside of elderly homes. So, and they produce a gigantic amount of smoke, and it is also very, very, very dangerous smoke, because of course we know now that in fact these lithium-ion batteries are like gas tanks, igniting themselves, so you can have explosions and that kind of thing. And so this is, I think, a major concern for me. Even I think that we should even more careful going in, even in domestic buildings, because now there are also energy storage systems in domestic buildings. We already had 2 fires where people, let's say, manufactured their own energy storage systems from old car batteries on their attic. So here comes the firefighter, and he can walk into an explosion. So we have them, but we do not really have the solution yet, because this is just one more reason to stop and think. And for the vehicles outside, the cars, for example, we are now trying to develop a way with the cold cutters to stop the thermal runaway. But we are now in the process of thinking what should we do with the big energy storage systems, letting them burn or not, and what if they are in a neighborhood where the smoke is dangerous? We don't know. So this is a real big problem for the future for us. And if there will be energy storage system inside the dwellings, that's really a big problem. And electrical cars in parking lots, for example, but how can you deal with that? Parking lots are already a big problem, we think, but now we have to deal with fires that can last longer than we used to. So how are we gonna get that car out of the? So I think, so you ask, we don't have solutions yet, but we are working on that, and we have these kind of fires. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Good answer.
Marco.
And then
Marco is there.
Please, Marco.
Yeah. Hello, my friend Marco. Your microphone is off, Marco.
Oh, sorry, my microphone is off. Greetings from Finland. It's a nice weather here, so
yeah.
We know from I put the camera off because I'm on the road. So with Ricardo, we have been working together for I don't know how many years, but a long time now. And of course, we could talk about the batteries a lot. But there was another thing that I thought I would like to bring up. As Ricardo knows, I did a long research, like 10 years of research at the Pelastusopiston. And we also did a lot of fire and extinguishing experiments. And after leaving that organization, I realized that one of the things I think we did wrong every single time is that we used thermocouples to measure the temperature of the gas. So basically, and there's a saying, you get what you measure. And I think what we got every time was the gas temperatures. And it took me a long time to realize that there is another component, and that's the surfaces, the solid materials of the fire. And when we've had these long discussions with the Americans about gas cooling with small droplets, and they do surface cooling with smooth or large droplets. And then I just realized that I think we are both right, but we also both at the same time. And maybe we should, when we study these things the next time, maybe we also.
Marco, the last sentence I didn't hear. I didn't hear your last sentence. Did you hear it, Joel?
Sorry, can you hear me still?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, yeah. So I think my connection is breaking up a little bit. So we usually measured only the gas temperatures in our experiments. And did you ever measure the actual temperatures of the surfaces, and what's the effect of our cooling technique on the surfaces? Because I think what you told us about the fact that you had this experiment or experience where you thought the fire was out using smoke cooling, and then when you open the door, it ignites almost immediately. And we've had the same experience, and I think the fact is that we are only cooling the gases, but we are not actually touching the surfaces at all, especially when we use very fine droplets. So, is this maybe something we could study in the future? What do you think?
Well, yes, I think you are correct. Most of these experiments are just measuring the temperature of the gas, of the air, or of the environment. And I think that we also did not put temperature sensors on the walls. But in the last experiments that we did, where we compared, let's say, the wall cooling, the surface cooling technique with the gas cooling technique, we did see that, of course, the cooling of the wall worked very well. So, Marco, so I think that is our main problem with real firefighting. Experiments are always in theory. So the theory of firefighting is very easy. Nothing changed in the theory. So small droplets, indeed, they cool better, etc., etc. But in practice, the translation from the theory to the practice is very difficult. And to make it practical, there will be not much difference. So that is also my conclusion from everything I read, the literature study and the experiments that we did in smoke cooling, is that it doesn't matter much in practice what you do if you put enough water inside. And that is the main thing. So I think I agree with you that cooling the surfaces is very important, and that it works, because that we showed. And in April next year we will finish some extra experiments for cooling techniques that we did not do yet. But maybe it is an idea to put the sensors on the wall. Then, because I know also that measuring the temperature of the gases is experimentally very difficult, because how do you know that you are really measuring the temperature of the gases and not the radiation that is coming from the walls, for example? So we put our sensors in special cases where the air can flow through, but the radiation cannot touch the sensors. But what if the water touches the sensor? Yeah, so it can seem that you cooled the gases, but maybe it was just the water that was touching the sensor. So, doing these kind of experiments is really a challenge. So it looks maybe very easy, but we had to think a lot about how to do this and have discussions. For example, a lot of discussions with Steve Kerber from UL, because they have a lot of experience in that. So yeah, I probably didn't answer your question, Marco, but I hope that I put some context in that.
Yeah, thank you. That is, I share the same problems that we had. We had also casings on our sensors, but then the casings get hot and the casings start to radiate. I mean, it's a really difficult problem.
Yes.
But I think what I have been fooled by was the fact that I trust too much on what I see, because when I'm putting out a fire, what I can see is the flames dying. So I can basically see the gas cooling. It can be so I can see that, but what I cannot see with my naked eye is the fact that whether the structures are cooling or not. You don't see it even. You only see it with your thermal camera, and I think that's something that we have a lot to learn still in our firefighting tactics, because because we don't see it. We have just to realize that okay, in the fire there are elements that we don't see.
Yes, and that we cannot measure. That is exactly, I think that now I try to recall our discussions about how to do these experiments, and now I know again that this was really not easy to do it, and it seems impossible. What we are doing is impossible. So about from practice back to practice, what we saw was that firefighters were taught to cool gases, and they forgot to put water on the fire. So But of course, to get back to the basics, put water on the fire is the best smoke cooling technique. That was somehow, maybe it sounds funny now, but that was what was happening. Yeah, so we were trying to make theory into practice and thought out difficult theories that were impossible to practice. I hope that this is what I found out. Yeah, so we taught firefighters things that were very difficult in practice, and that didn't work either. So yeah, if you can put water on the fire, you should do it. That is and of course that sounds like but we started to not do that. Yes, because we were doing all kind of difficult things. But so I'm curious, is it because I see a lot of course not faces, but is this something that you think like now? Okay, so let's go on, or is it of interest for you, or did I say something interesting for you, or is it something you already knew?
So people are please.
Of course, I'm interested in how you think about this.
Yes, hello, I'm Antti Kinnunen from the Finnish Association of Fire Officers. There were many interesting things in your presentation, and I think the 4-quadrant model is kind of, we're learning to think and act according to that model, but I'm thinking that we are not there yet because it's quite new thing in Finland, and we have been training like the traditional training has been always same as yours, like the interior aggressive extinguishing tactic. But there was you mentioned also that you have changed the incident command system or reevaluated it. But how do you train and educate the kind of the updated system for the officers?
Yes, well, we developed a new training where first, of course, there is awareness about your, let's say, your possibilities as a fire officer or as a human being when you are acting under stress. So first, you have to create the awareness. So part of that new training is creating awareness. And so also creating the stress circumstances so that people can really experience themselves under stress situations. And that is the first thing. And then, of course, when they have that awareness, they know that they will miss things, and that can differ per person. So some persons have a small bias, yes, and some people have a wide bias, and of course, some people are very good, and they can, for example, by stepping back, they can change their bias. But the first thing, if you have that awareness, is the first thing is for fire officers. If you are an officer in charge, you would have to do your own reconnaissance and not just step in to the tactics that were developed by the crew commander. So your overvalue would be that you step back physically and mentally, look again, and then see if the tactics that are being followed are still the right ones. So that is. And you think that this is easy to do, but it is not, because we developed that new training with the real fires. Let's say a real fire that we developed into a training, and then we put body cams on fire officers, and we let them experience how they react in stress circumstances, and most of the time they don't even remember afterwards what they did. And that is really challenging if you see what you did on your camera, because that is always true. So that is the first step. And then, of course, what can you do about that? And then, of course, stepping backwards and stepping forwards and making a physical and mental distance is one of the first thing. And then we have, of course, the idea that I don't know if it is in Finland the same, but for example, when I was in my education, I was taught that when I arrive, I tell the crew commanders that I take over charge. So then I'm in charge. But we teach them now that they don't need to take over immediately, but they can do their own reconnaissance. And that crew commanders are well trained to do their own thing until you have the complete picture. So that is a different, and that is what we teach them now. And then the second thing is that the safety net. We taught them that if you have a complex fire, then you should call for a safety net. That was, of course, also an organizational challenge because you need to have extra officers, or maybe you need a colleague officer that is sitting on the side of his bed, looking at your, let's say, FaceTime camera, like that. And then we did a pilot with it. So we educated 60 officers from 4 different fire safety regions into this system. And then we send them back to their region and ask them, record all your fires or all your incidents, and let's evaluate on a national level. And it turned out the main conclusion was that they didn't do what they were taught. So for me, it was, again, surprising, of course. I didn't expect that. And then, of course, we started thinking like, okay, but if you are in a circus and you are dancing on the high rope, it is very difficult to call your safety net if you think you are going to fall. So the safety net should be there already. So you should automate that safety net. And that is what we are doing now. We are trying now the emergency rooms that, for example, after 50 minutes, they will send an extra officer, which has only one duty: observe and be the safety net. So that is what we are implementing now, an automatic safety net for fire officers. And of course, this is very difficult for crew commanders because they are on their own in the beginning. And that's why we think that the first officer that arrives should be the safety net, the observer for the crew commander. And in the time that he is not there, one of the crew members should be the safety net, or maybe the second crew commander could be the safety net. So this is, and I think that now, well, this is not easy. So we have it now in our new education in this way, and we also teach them that we call it swarming. That it is not so bad if there is a very complex or big incident and there are maybe more crews at the location of the incident, and you arrive as an officer, that you don't need to take over command immediately, but that your overvalue is there to take over when you have your own picture ready. So that is what we teach them. But of course, this is also something that is in a transition. So you can, I wouldn't say that everybody does it now like that, because it also asks for organizational changes, and it asks for awareness, and we have a lot of older officers, of course. And maybe one of the things that I am trying to do now in the Netherlands is what from that pilot where we had that 60 officers, it was for me amazing that they didn't do what they were taught. So apparently, under stress circumstances, you are not even able to call for your own safety net. So this was for me a surprise. But what we also saw, that when we started evaluating all these incidents for 60 officers within the region, and after that on a national level, that I realized that there is no, in the Netherlands at least, there is no, let's say, system where beginning officers are let's say, coached to become an experienced officer. So because there are not many senior officers that are capable of, let's say, having enough, let's say, experience and knowledge of firefighting, as well as having the right social skills to how to give feedback. That is now, I think, is a challenge. So what I am promoting now in the Netherlands, that there should be a professional system where we coach, let's say, young crew commanders and fire officers to become experienced in the right way, because I think that we now put them on let's say we just send them to fires without experience, and luckily it always goes, it went okay, but until it doesn't. Okay, but I hope this is Antti. Is this a question? Is this an answer for your question?
Yes, it was, and I think that we have to also think in Finland our command and control system, incident command system, because I assume we have maybe the same problems as you. So, but we are kind of doing it in the old way and probably not knowing how it really works. So it's really important that you have a practical research to back your kind of ideas and development process.
Yes, yes. I think that in exercises you can already see it, but that suppose that if you have an exercise with, for example, 4 engines and 4 crew commanders and 1 officer in charge, suppose that it is not a real, let's say, routine exercise, but something a little bit more difficult that asks for more knowledge, or that is more complex with, let's say, more unpredictable development. Let's say that you have such an exercise, and suppose that the crew commanders would just stand there and wait for your orders, then you can see what happens. Because then I think that the officer in charge will completely be out of control. Information overload, because nobody is doing anything. Everybody is focusing attention to that officer, and then it goes wrong. So the system needs to be flexible, that crew commanders can do what they think is right, because they also have their education, until the officer in charge has a plan. And maybe the plan is the same, or maybe the plan is different. But that is what we that we learned, and the fact was that it already went like that. So we had a system that we taught people that didn't work in practice, and so we didn't do it in practice. But in the evaluation, we were telling them that they did it wrong, because they had to do it according to what they were educated. So this was strange. I think that in Finland, crew commanders are not waiting for the officer in charge to give them an order.
Yeah, I think we are quite similar in that way, but still we teach the incident command in the old way.
Yeah. So we are, but then we are teaching people that something that doesn't work in practice, and in practice they find their own way, and that is not bad, because but in our case, the inspection, the fire service inspection from the ministry said, yeah, but you didn't do it like you were taught, so this is bad, and that so this is for me the main that I thought, but this was a very complex incident with hazardous materials, with smoke, with let's say, and how can you expect that the officer in charge takes all the decisions? That is impossible, even if the surface area where this incident was taking place was too big to overview. So this, so I hope this is inspiring. So you are not the only ones, and I really think that this would be very nice for officers and crew commanders to talk about with each other and see what. And this report is in English, is available in English, and especially all these psychological, neurobiological aspects of working under stress circumstances was, for me, it was an eye opener. So for me, I had to leave all my beliefs.
Great, thank you, Ricardo. No more questions.